Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The call came just as I was preparing my afternoon tea, around 3 o'clock, when the golden sunlight spills through the kitchen window and paints everything in warm amber. I remember reaching for the lavender honey. It was the only kind Robert ever liked, and feeling my heart catch when the phone buzzed unexpectedly. These days, I rarely get calls that aren't from my daughter or an old friend checking in. But that name on the screen, it stopped me cold. Greg Walters. I hadn't seen or spoken to Greg in over 7 years. He'd worked with my husband Robert at the engineering firm downtown, one of the few people Robert trusted enough to bring around our home for the occasional Sunday dinner. I stared at the phone, letting it ring an extra beat or two, unsure whether to answer. The past has a way of staying buried until it doesn't. I picked it up. "Hello," I said, my voice more uncertain than I expected. "Carol, it's Greg." His voice hadn't changed. Deep, calm, with that thoughtful pause between phrases, like every word was carefully weighed. I hope this isn't a bad time." It was the way he said my name, like he was stepping carefully over something fragile. "No, it's fine," I replied, brushing a strand of gray-streaked hair from my cheek. "It's been a long time." He let out a soft breath. "Yeah, too long. I'm sorry it's taken me this long to call. I wasn't sure if I should. I thought about it a dozen times over the years, but today just, I don't know, felt right." I sat down at the small kitchen table, the mug forgotten. What made today the day? There was silence on the other end, but not an uncomfortable one, more like he was searching for the right door to walk through. "I was going through some old things," he said finally. "Work files, photos, a box I hadn't opened since Robert passed. There was a note from him, written to me, about you." My stomach fluttered, unexpectedly. I hadn't heard Robert's name said aloud in a while. Most people skirted around it, offering only careful sympathy, like grief was something to be avoided rather than embraced. But Greg said it plainly, with the weight of memory behind it. "A note?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "Yeah," he said. "Would you be open to meeting? Just to talk. There's something I think you should hear. From me, in person." I hesitated, not because I was unwilling, but because I was startled by the sudden rush of emotions, the kind that don't fit neatly into words. Greg had always been kind, quiet, a presence more felt than heard. He was never the type to intrude. If he was calling now, it meant something. "All right," I said. "Where?" "There's a little cafe not far from my neighborhood, the Red Fern. It's tucked between an antique bookstore and a plant shop that sells herbs in tiny ceramic pots. Robert used to meet colleagues there for lunch. I hadn't stepped inside since the funeral. We agreed to meet the following morning. When I arrived, I almost didn't recognize him at first. He was standing near the counter, his hands tucked into the pockets of a wool coat, his posture still that same gentle curve that suggested he was trying not to take up too much space. His hair had thinned, and his beard was mostly gray, but when he turned and saw me, his eyes lit up with something warm, familiar. "Carol," he said, smiling, "you look well." I smiled back, unsure what to do with the nerves flickering in my chest. "You too. It's strange, isn't it? Seeing each other again after so long." We sat at a small corner table, the kind where conversations stay close and quiet. The cafe smelled like cinnamon and fresh coffee, and for a moment, I just listened to the soft hum of other people's lives around us, the low clink of spoons, the distant hiss of the espresso machine. It was comforting in an odd way, a world that had kept turning even after mine had paused. Greg reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, worn in the folds. My heart beat a little faster. "I found this in a drawer," he said, "dated 2 weeks before Robert's heart attack. It was addressed to me, but it's about you." He slid it across the table. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded it. Robert's handwriting, strong, deliberate, unmistakably his, danced across the page. I hadn't seen it in years, and yet the sight of it felt like stepping into a memory. In the letter, Robert wrote about his admiration for Greg, about how, if anything were ever to happen to him, he hoped Greg would keep an eye on me, not in a protective way, but as someone who understood who I really was. Someone who had once, years ago, confessed to Robert, quietly, respectfully, that he had feelings for me. I read the words over and over. Robert had known, and he hadn't been angry. He'd thanked Greg for his honesty, told him he trusted him more than anyone else in his life, that he knew Greg would never overstep, but if there ever came a time, after grief had settled and time had done its quiet work, that he would want Greg to be a part of my life if I wanted that too. I'd looked up, the letter trembling in my hands. "You told him?" I asked softly. Greg's expression was unreadable at first. Then he nodded. It was years ago, before his diagnosis. We were drinking one night after a work retreat. I never meant for him to find out that way, but I couldn't hold it in. I told him I admired your strength, your kindness, the way you laughed. He listened. Then he hugged me and said he already knew. I didn't know what to say. The room seemed quieter somehow. My eyes burned a little, but I blinked quickly. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "I couldn't," he said. "It wasn't my place. You were happy. And Robert, he was my best friend. I never wanted to come between you. But after he passed, I kept thinking about that letter and what he said about time." The pause stretched between us like a gentle current. "I'm not here to make anything difficult for you, Carol. I wanted you to know, and maybe, if you ever felt the same, we could talk, or walk, or just share coffee from time to time." It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't even a request. It was an opening, a quiet, respectful one that made space for grief, for healing, for something tender to bloom in the cracks of loss. I folded the letter and slid it back into his hands. "Maybe," I said, my voice steady, "we could start with a walk." Greg smiled. And it wasn't just polite, it was warm, filled with something unspoken but deeply felt. We left the cafe and stepped into the bright afternoon. The past hadn't vanished, but it had settled a little. The path ahead was uncertain, yes, but also unexpectedly open. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so alone. He walked beside me, not ahead or behind, just beside. Quiet, steady, familiar. And I let myself lean into that silence just a little as we turned the corner into whatever came next. That walk from the cafe didn't last more than 15 minutes, but it stayed with me all evening. After Greg and I said goodbye, with no promise, no pressure, just a shared glance that lingered a moment longer than expected, I walked up my porch steps with a strange lightness in my chest, like I'd been holding my breath for years without knowing it. And now, finally, I'd exhaled. That night, I pulled out the old photo albums, the ones I hadn't dared open since Robert died. They'd been sitting in the hall closet, behind the Christmas decorations and an unopened bread maker my daughter once gifted me. As I sat cross-legged on the rug in my living room, turning page after page, I saw Robert's face smiling at me again. And there was Greg, too, in several of the pictures, always in the background, often with a hand on Robert's shoulder or a drink in his hand, half turned toward me with that quiet, knowing expression. There had always been something there, hadn't there? The next morning, I got a message from Greg. "Thank you for yesterday. Would love to see you again. No pressure. Just maybe another walk, if you're up for it." I stared at it for longer than necessary, feeling that familiar flutter behind my ribs. I wasn't a teenager, and yet my heart responded like one. But it wasn't the reckless excitement of youth. It was something more grounded, softer, wiser. I replied with a simple yes. Tomorrow afternoon, same place. We met at the park this time, a quiet one on the edge of town, where wide gravel paths wound between old oak trees and a gentle stream curved through tall grass. It was late afternoon, the golden hour, when everything looks softer and the world feels like it's trying to be kind. He brought me a coffee, just how I like it, 2 sugars, no cream. I hadn't told him that. He remembered. "Thank you," I said, taking it from him. He nodded, his hands deep in his coat pockets. "You look peaceful today." I smiled. "I feel it, oddly enough. It's been a while since I've felt seen." He looked at me with that same stillness I remembered from years ago, the kind that didn't push or prod, just listened. We walked in silence for a while, our footsteps crunching gently on the gravel. Families passed by, children chasing one another, dogs tugging leashes, couples walking with shoulders pressed close. The ordinary, beautiful rhythm of life. "I almost left town after Robert died," Greg said suddenly. "I got a job offer in Portland. Good pay, good role. But I couldn't bring myself to go. Something about leaving felt wrong." "Why didn't you?" He hesitated, then shrugged. I told myself it was loyalty to the firm, to Robert's memory. But honestly, I think it was you. My breath caught. "I know that sounds selfish," he added quickly. "I never meant to hold on to anything that wasn't mine. But I couldn't imagine not being near the life you built together. You were part of the best moments of my life, even if I wasn't at the center of them." I looked up at him, seeing him more clearly than I ever had. "You were there," I said softly. "You were always there. And I think maybe I took comfort in that without even realizing it." We sat on a bench beneath a sycamore, its wide leaves trembling in the breeze. "I've asked myself so many times if it's wrong," I admitted, "to feel anything beyond grief, to imagine something new, even this late in life, like it's betraying Robert somehow." Greg turned to face me, his voice low but certain. "You're not betraying anyone, Carol. He loved you. And he wanted you to keep living, to feel joy again. That letter, he wasn't giving me permission, he was giving you permission. To feel, to heal, to reach." We sat in silence after that, but it wasn't empty. It was full with memories, with quiet understanding, with the tentative threads of something beginning. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. No dreams, just warmth. In the days that followed, we met more often, sometimes just for coffee, sometimes a short walk. Sometimes we sat on my porch and talked about nothing and everything. He never pushed. He never expected. He simply showed up, steadily, kindly, just as he always had. Then one evening, after a quiet dinner at a small Italian place near the library, we lingered outside my front door. "Do you remember the last time we were here?" I asked, turning the key in my hand. He nodded. Robert grilled steak. You made that lemon pasta he loved, and I'd brought that terrible bottle of red wine. We both laughed, and the memory wrapped around us like a blanket. He told me, I said, turning to him. That night, after you left, he said he thought you'd loved me for a long time. He said it wasn't a threat. It was a gift. That love, real love, wasn't possession. It was presence. And he trusted you. Greg's eyes shimmered in the porch light. He said that? I nodded. And now, I think I'm finally ready to believe it. I didn't invite him in that night. Not because I didn't want to, but because what we were building needed space, respect, and the slow unfolding of two hearts remembering how to open. He kissed my cheek gently. His hand brushed mine, lingering for a second longer than necessary. I'm here, he said. And he was. For the first time in a long, long while, someone was. The morning light came through the curtains in soft stripes, and I lay there for a while, listening to the hush of the house. It was one of those rare mornings where the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned, like a space carved gently into the noise of life. I hadn't felt this way in years. Not since before Robert's illness. Not since the long months of hospital visits, hushed conversations, and the aching, quiet after. But lately there was warmth again. Greg and I had fallen into a rhythm. A slow, respectful cadence of calls, visits, and easy conversations that wrapped around the edges of my days. It wasn't a romance in the dramatic sense. There were no breathless declarations or wild gestures. It was something quieter, truer, the kind of connection that slips in like a tide, soft, persistent, and impossible to ignore. That Saturday, he invited me to the botanical garden outside town. It used to be Robert's favorite place. We went every spring to see the cherry blossoms bloom in their brief, breathtaking glory. I hesitated for a moment before answering his message. The garden held memories, too many, too vivid. But something in me was ready. I felt it in the steadiness of my breath, in the quiet certainty that Robert wouldn't want the memory of beauty to be locked away in grief. Let's go, I texted back. We met at the entrance just after noon. Greg wore a light jacket, and he'd brought a thermos of hot tea and 2 travel cups. I smiled when he handed me one without a word. You remembered, I said, surprised. Mint and chamomile. You mentioned it once. Years ago. The garden paths were dappled with light and shade, winding through beds of tulips, peonies, and lilies in bloom. Couples wandered past, children darted between benches, and every now and then a breeze stirred the leaves, releasing the faintest scent of lilac. We walked for a long time without saying much. And then, near the koi pond, we stopped. I didn't know if this would be too much, he said gently. Too soon. I looked out over the water, where the fish shimmered beneath the surface like dreams barely remembered. It's not too soon, I said. It's exactly when it needs to be. He nodded, then hesitated. Carol, can I ask something? Not as someone who cares for you, just as a man trying to understand a woman he respects. Of course. When Robert died, did you ever feel like you didn't know who you were anymore? Like you were still living your life, but from the outside? I took a deep breath. All the time, I said. I think I lost more than a husband. I lost the version of myself that existed with him. Our rhythm, our inside jokes, our routines. Even the way I made eggs was because that's how he liked them. And after he passed, I didn't know which parts were mine and which parts were just echoes. He looked down, nodding slowly. "I've been carrying guilt," he said. "Not just for how I felt about you, but for not saying anything sooner. For hiding how much I missed both of you. You two were my only real family." I touched his hand then. Not for comfort, not out of sympathy, but out of recognition, shared grief, shared understanding. "You were a part of our family," I said. "And you're still here. That matters more than you realize." We sat on a bench, the tea cooling in our cups. He pulled something from his coat pocket, a small, worn photo. I leaned in. It was one of the few I didn't remember taking. Robert, me, and Greg, sitting on my old back porch. Summer. Laughter frozen in time. I looked so alive in that photo. Head thrown back, Robert leaning into me, Greg mid-smile. The kind of candid that captures something real. "Do you remember that day?" he asked. I nodded. That was the day the grill broke, and Robert tried to fix it with duct tape. We both laughed. And just like that, the sorrow softened. "I miss him," Greg said after a moment. "Still. Every day. But I also feel something new now. Not instead of grief, but alongside it. And I think it's because of you." I looked at him, really looked. The man who had sat in the background of my life for years, who had quietly carried his feelings like a stone in his pocket, who had stepped forward not with boldness, but with grace. "I feel it too," I said. "Not instead of missing Robert, not to replace anything, but because we're still alive, and we're allowed to feel joy." He reached for my hand then, and I let him take it. We didn't need to name what was happening between us. We simply lived it, moment by moment, letting it unfold like the petals of the garden around us. Later, as the sun dipped lower and the sky began to turn gold, we walked back to the parking lot. He opened my car door for me, as he always had. But before I stepped inside, I turned to him. "You can come over for dinner next week," I said, surprising even myself. "If you'd like." His face lit up. "I'd like that very much." And I drove home with the window down, the wind in my hair, and something warm blooming in my chest. Something like peace. Something like hope. Something like love. The day Greg came over for dinner felt like a turning point, not just in our connection, but in how I saw my own life. I'd spent so many years building routines around absence, constructing careful days that never leaned too far into joy or grief. I had convinced myself I was at peace, that stillness was enough. But as I set the table that evening, 2 places instead of 1, fresh flowers in a short vase, a lemon tart cooling on the windowsill, I realized I wasn't just preparing for company. I was preparing to let someone in again. Greg arrived with a bottle of wine, and that quiet smile of his, the one that always made it feel like everything would be okay, even if the world outside was unpredictable. He wore a simple button-up shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to show his forearms, and his eyes scanned the room with that familiar blend of warmth and gentle curiosity. "It smells like rosemary," he said as I opened the door. "It is. Chicken thighs roasted with rosemary and garlic. I used to make it for Robert when he had a bad day." He hesitated just a second, then stepped inside. "I'm honored you made it for me." I don't remember the last time I'd cooked for someone like that, really cooked, with intention. We sat across from each other, candlelight flickering softly between us, and as the night unfolded, so did we. We talked about simple things, our worst cooking disasters, old psalms we'd nearly forgotten, the first cars we drove. And then, as the meal wound down, and we shared slices of tart over coffee, our conversation drifted to the more delicate corners of our lives. "Do you ever think about starting over?" I asked, running my finger along the rim of my mug. "Every day," he said. But I think I used to picture starting over as wiping the slate clean. And now, I think it's more like planting something new in the garden that's already there. Not erasing the past, just letting the future grow beside it. I stared at him for a moment, letting those words settle. "I like that," I said. "A lot." After we cleared the dishes, we sat on the couch. Close, but not pressed together. Just enough space between us to hold both silence and possibility. He looked over at me, a softness in his expression. "Carol, I want to say something, and I want to get it right." I turned toward him, heart gently tapping against my ribs. I never expected this, any of this. Not the letter, not the walks, not whatever this is becoming. I thought I'd be alone forever, and I made peace with that. But being around you, it doesn't feel like a second chance. It feels like a continuation. Like Robert gave us permission not just in that note, but in how he lived. He loved people deeply. And I think he wanted us to keep loving too. I swallowed hard. My eyes burned. "Sometimes I feel guilty for smiling again," I admitted, "for having a full day without aching." "You don't have to," he said. "You're allowed to feel everything. Grief, joy, even both in the same breath." There it was again, that presence. Not demanding, not trying to fix me. Just there. I reached over and took his hand. "I'm not ready for promises," I said. "I'm not asking for any," he replied. "But I am ready for today, for this." He nodded. "That's all I want." He stayed a little longer. We didn't kiss, not that night. But he held my hand, and we sat like that until the clock quietly reminded us of time slipping by. When he left, I walked him to the door. He paused there, turned back. "Would it be all right if I called you tomorrow?" "Yes," I said, smiling. "Please do." And he did. We didn't rush anything. Over the weeks that followed, we wove something steady between us. Not a replacement for what we'd lost, but a reflection of what we'd learned. We honored the past. Not by living in it, but by letting it gently inform how we moved forward. One afternoon in late autumn, we returned to the garden. The cherry trees were bare by then, but the benches were still there, the paths still familiar. We walked the same route we had on that golden afternoon, and as we passed the koi pond, he stopped. "I'd wanted to tell you something," he said, voice low. I turned to him, heart calm. "I love you, Carol, and I don't need anything from you. I just need you to know." It didn't take me by surprise. I think I'd known for a while. "I love you too," I said. "And I think maybe I always have. I just didn't realize it then." He reached for my hand, and I let him. We sat on the bench again, watching the wind stir the empty branches above us. And in that moment, it didn't feel like an ending or even a beginning. It just felt right. A continuation. Life, after all, isn't about starting over. It's about allowing love, unexpected, tender, and deeply earned, to find its place beside the memories we hold dear. And as we sat there in the quiet, I knew one thing with certainty. I wasn't alone anymore. Not in grief. Not in love. Not in life.